Okay, I'm gonna use again, I think I was muted, so I'm gonna start again. This is your homework, and this is what you were supposed to calculate, assuming an economy that was producing only TVs and cars. So they were giving you the data of how many TVs and cars were produced at which price each year. So with this information, you are supposed to calculate the nominal GDP, then the real GDP using the 2002 year as our baseline year. Remember, we want to use the prices of the baseline year, so we don't look at the change in prices over time, but just the change in quantity over time using the prices of a base year. Then we're gonna calculate the real growth rate, so meaning how much the GDP has changed between years, and also the nominal growth rate. We can calculate, we can see the discrepancies between nominal and real growth rate, and that will give us information to provide an inflation rate if we want. Otherwise, we can calculate the inflation rate just by calculating the rate of change of all the prices changing, in this case, TVs and cars over time. So here's the answers. Here are the answers. I'm gonna put the answers on the next slide so you can see them clearly. So then you have our nominal GDP, we have our real GDP of each year using the prices of 2002. So we're calculating quantity of TVs times price of the year 2002, then quantities of cars times the year's price of 2002. And that gave us a certain amount of money, which is here reflected the real GDP based on a base year. The nominal was just multiplying the amount times the price of each year of cars and TVs and adding it up. And then we have our values of each year. And then we want to calculate the growth rate. Then we use the new value minus the old value divided by the old value. So we can clearly see here that according to the real GDP, even the nominal was showing that, but in 2001, this economy produced less goods and services than the former year, measured in monetary terms. So we have a minus 17% of production. So this is what we say, a contraction of the economy. The economy contracted 17%. They are producing 17% less than the last year in monetary terms. Now the next year, they were increasing again their GDP by 48% compared to the last year. And then again, they were increasing by almost 20%, so 19% of economic growth. These values, of course, are just for the example. These are very unusual values. We don't see a country growing more than 10%, 12%. That would be a maximum that we can see between years. The nominal GDP rate, now we have the nominal rate of change, which is inflated, of course, because we're saying how inflation creates a false perception of the real growth, because now this is including the inflation rate, okay, or the change in prices. Now we have the inflation rate here. So again, the inflation rate is calculated by either calculating the change in prices over time, or we can use the GDP deflator. Now that we have the real GDP and the nominal GDP, we can find the deflator by just dividing the nominal over the real GDP and multiplying by 100, then we have our value of the deflator. So you were not asked to do that. I just did it just so you can see how the deflator has changed over time. And then we see the deflator, if we look at the change of the GDP, sorry, because the deflator is not the GDP but the prices, we can see the change of the prices over time. We can clearly see that over time in this economy, prices have been increasing, or we can say that there's inflation happening. What is the rate of inflation? Then we use our formula again, new minus old divided by old times 100. Times 100, that will be the rate of change of the GDP deflator, or the rate of change in the price level of this economy. In this case, we have 5%, 5.8, and 5.3. If we calculate it just by the change in the prices, let's say of TVs and cars, we added up, and each year we calculated the value or the difference between the total prices of one year minus the total prices over the other year divided by the total price of the other year. Then we have also an inflation rate value, which, as you can tell, is very similar, even if not totally accurate, but we're looking at a 5% in average of change of prices in the economy. So again, Now we can see how inflation rate creates some noise when we talk about nominal growth. We want to look at the real growth of the economy by looking at the change of the real GDP over time. Let me go very quickly with this concept of stock variables and growth variables. When we are measuring the economy in terms of production or in terms of the GDP measured in monetary terms, then we have what we were saying the other day that is called a stock variable. This is not the stock market. This is just the stock variable. So we're talking about something that can be measured in absolute terms, meaning we have a certain amount of these type of variables. We have a certain amount of cans of food, for example. It is being stocked in our refrigerator right now. So we have 24 cans of food, or we have 30 pairs of shoes. Anything that is being measured in absolute terms is a stock variable, okay? It's a variable that we can count. It's fixed, okay? In a particular period of time, or a particular amount in time is a fixed value. So the GDP measured in monetary terms, as we have said, is a stock value or a stock variable on a particular year, okay? So we have GDP as a stock value on a particular year. But growth is a rate of change. We say growth is a flow variable. They say the amount of cans that are being produced in per day, for example, per day. So we're talking about a flow. This is changing over time, okay? So how many cans are we producing per month, or how many money is being produced in the economy between one year and the next one, meaning how many goods and services have been produced in monetary terms. That's our GDP growth rate. So the GDP growth rate is a flow variable, okay? And a flow variable meaning we're looking at the rate of change over time. So we can have a flow variable that says 10%, so we are producing 10% more than last year, or 7%, we are producing 7% more than last year. Now what happens between these 2 years? Is the GDP decreasing? No, the GDP is still increasing. Now, it increased 10% last year, it increased 7% this year, but it's still increasing. It's still a positive flow, it's a positive rate of change. If we have something like this, a minus 2%, now we're looking at a negative growth. So we're talking about a contraction of the economy. So this is definitely telling us that we're producing less than last year, but here we're producing more than last year. Even if last year was producing 10%, now the thing is that we are producing in a lower rate or in a lower pace than last year, but we are still producing more, 7% more than last year. So that's how we're reading the growth rates of the GDP. So that being said, look at this graph. What do you think is this, a flow or a stock graph? So you may say, oh, look, let's look what we are measuring. And the reason I want to point this out is the way that we read the graphs is very important in economics. We need to know what are we measuring in the y-axis and in the x-axis. In this case, we're looking at millions of tons of wheat or grain produced in between these years. So each year, we have a certain amount of millions of tons produced on 1960, on 1970, etc. So we have the amount. So each point of this line is actually a stock variable, isn't it? It's a stock of wheat that we have produced each year. Now, some of you may say, well, this graph also shows you a flow. Well, it is not shown in the axis, it is not shown here, but because this is in millions of tons, this is an amount. But if we want to look at the rate of change, well, for those who like mathematics, then you can say, well, we can calculate the rate of change between 2 years, don't we? So if we have the two stock values of 1 year and the other year, then we can just say, okay, we're gonna calculate the deltas. Again, the deltas will be the rate of change between 1970 and well, in this case, we're in 1960 and 1970. So how much the rate that the grain production has changed between these 2 years, these 10 years? So we can just say, okay, we're going to calculate again the new value minus the old value divided the old value times 100. And then we have the rate of change or the delta or the flow variable of how much more grains this economy was producing over time, okay? Now, you like calculus, you can use the first derivative of this slope. That's a different thing. We're not using calculus here. We're just looking at the rate of change in a very basic model, okay? Very basic way of change, of calculating. How about this? What can you say about this? Flow or stock variables? Well, if you look at the graph, then you can say, okay, what the graph is actually measuring. The graph is measuring a certain rate of change, so the percentage change of whatever this is producing over time. So this is a flow variable, okay? Can we say how much are they producing in this case in California, the USA, and Roseville? Can we say how much in total? No, we cannot say that because we don't have absolute values. Okay, we don't really know. They may be producing 10 liters of whatever this is per week. This is the amount of weeks. Or they can produce maybe thousands of liters each of these amounts of week. Now we're measuring here the rate of change between these weeks or these years. Sorry, this is the rate of change between years. So between 1997 and 1996, they produced 6% more. Between 1997 and 1998, 6% more. So again, we are looking at how much more they are producing. Now here's a question for you. What happened between let's look at the year 2001. So between the year 2000 and the year 2001, what can we say that happened? Did they produce less than last year or more than last year? Well, it's still a positive rate of change, isn't it? So we're looking at they are still producing more, but at a slower rate than last year, okay? So again, the same situation, even if we look at this going down, that means it's going down, but it's still above 0%. If it's above 0%, we're looking at rate of change that is positive, so we are producing more each year according to this flow that is positive, positive, and positive, okay? There's not in the USA, not in California, neither in Roseville, there's no year that they have produced less because that would be a negative rate of change, but that is not really reflected here in the graph. Now we have an interesting graph here that is showing us how the total production, now we're looking at the size of the economy measured in monetary terms, and this is inflation adjusted. Now we know what this means. This means now we're taking away the inflation. So the real GDP of these economies in trillions, the USA has been growing steadily over time. Again, you want to look at the rate of change each year, more or less has been about 3% each year over time. Whereas China, if you can tell, it has been growing in a very interesting way. After a certain year, they have been growing exponentially, okay? So they are actually increasing the rate of growth over time in a higher than proportional percentage rate. So they are really growing faster, okay? They were producing less than the USA in the year 2000, the year 1990, but they were actually growing and accelerating the rate of growth as years goes by until they reach the point that they are producing more than the USA. According to these projections, this is all data. They were supposed to catch up with the USA in the year 2018. Now that hasn't happened yet, but we are in between this area. So China is almost about to produce more than the USA in absolute terms. Now, we are in 2020, COVID. Now we're looking at recession happening all over the world. So maybe this is going to change. This pattern may go down and this pattern may go down. The velocity of growth that we just saw there is actually the rate of change that we were looking at. And this is the GDP of the rate of growth of the GDP of the USA. And again, we're looking at, remember, I told you the rate of growth was about, in average, how much? 3%. Actually, this is the delta, isn't it? This is the first derivative. This is the slope of the graph that we were looking at. We were looking here at as the blue one. So this is the rate of change in average of the GDP of the USA, about 3% per year. Now in China, we were looking at a rate of growth that has been changing, but actually all the time has been, according to this period of time, from the 80s, has been faster than the USA. So there were some years that they were changing their growth almost 14% compared to the last year, whereas the USA was changing by 3.8%, for example, compared to the last year. So now we look at not the size of the economy, but the rate of growth or the velocity or the speed, okay? Velocity of producing more. Who is producing faster? China. And the USA is producing in a steady pace. And that's what we saw in the former graph. Okay, so this is actually telling us the slope of the GDP in monetary terms. Okay. Is total GDP enough? What do you think, guys? Do you think that GDP measures is telling us the whole picture of an economy producing? Now you have a lot to say. You may say, well, it's not enough because we need to talk about if it's real or it's nominal. Well, if it's real GDP, now we're looking at the real production. But let's subtract the GNP, well, let's calculate the GNP. Well, GDP is not enough because we have to take away the money that is flowing out from the country as term of factor income, plus the income of factors of production that are abroad, that are repatriating their payments of their factors. Also, you can say, well, how about depreciation? If all the capital goods are depreciating, then the GDP is not telling us the big picture, but it has to be subtracting the destruction of the capital goods that over time they are destructed. So GDP is not really the best way of calculating prosperity of a country, but in economics, we use it in terms of producing goods and services over time. Now, let's look at this situation. What if I give you these values? Country 1, country 2, and country 3. Based on these values, which country is actually the richest or the one that produces more? If we want to look at the one that produces more, is country number 3, isn't it? Country 3 is producing $50 million, okay? Now, country 2 and country 1, they are producing the same amount. Now, what if we put, again, more data here? Let's put population, because you will see the amount of money in general is just telling us the country itself is producing a lot of money, but actually people are the ones who are producing money. So if we divide the GDP produced by the population of each country, now we have a different situation. Let's say in country 1, the population was 5 million. So instead of producing $10 million overall, if we divide it by the population, now we have the value of the GDP per capita, okay? We mentioned per capita to say per person, okay? Capita means head. So the GDP per capita or the GDP per person is not other thing than just dividing the total GDP by the population of the country, okay? So this is a big debate because again, you may say, well, we are just calculating the population, including everyone that is studying and is not really producing. For example, yourselves, you are actually investing. You are not producing anything right now. You are just studying. My kids, for example, they are just studying. They are minors and they are counted into this population. So even newly born people are going to be counted here. So dividing the GDP over the population also has its flaws because also this is counting everyone in the country. And what is the other flaw? We're talking about an average, okay? And this is a simple average, okay? The simple average is just telling us everyone is earning the same amount because we're just dividing the total amount over the total population. So in average, we're earning a certain amount, assuming that everyone earns exactly the same, which you will say, well, this is not true. Some people earn more, some people earn less. Let's look at this other country. Okay, so the other country that is we see here, they're actually producing the same as country one, but they have a smaller population. So the GDP per capita here, that would be bigger per capita, per person. And how about this other country? Wow, look at this country. They were producing a lot, but now they have also a lot of people. This could be a country like China or Mexico. Even if the numbers are not the same, we can say, well, country that produces a lot, but with a lot of people, the GDP per capita is going to be distributed among all these people. So it will change the whole situation. Instead of being the richest country, the country 3, now the richest country happened to be country 2. Because dividing the GDP over population, if we were distributing evenly everything that is being produced, now in country 2, each member of that country or each citizen will receive $14.2 per year or per month or whatever we are measuring it. So compared to the other one that is 1.78 and the other one that is only $2. So this also is an important thing to think about when we compare countries. If we compare the GDP per capita, we are comparing a simple average and we're dividing the total production over the simple, over the amount of people who live in that country, and that will give us a way of comparing one country to another and to say, well, this country is richer per person than these other two countries. If we look at real growth and population growth, then we also have the per capita growth. So for example, if Denmark was growing 0.4% and the GDP was growing 2.1%, then we have a growth rate that is going to be telling us that it's negative because they are actually producing, they are producing more. It's not negative, it's positive because their population is not growing at the same rate as its GDP. So actually GDP is producing more than people who are being born in Denmark, including immigrants. Remember, Brett House was talking about how in Canada, the immigration policies are going to be a situation in which if they stop people migrating, then again, the population growth will start to decline. That is a problem for the long run for economies. Now, an economy that is producing more than what the people who are there, that means that there's more money available for these people. Now, in Bolivia, we have a population growth that is bigger or is faster than Denmark. And again, their GDP is also bigger. So they still have a positive GDP growth when we talk about the population growth, or the GDP per capita growth is going to be still positive because 1.6 minus 4.2, they still have, we're still talking about maybe 2% more of GDP growth, okay? Now we see what happens in some countries. The low-income countries, they have high population growth. Sorry, this is the GNP of the low-income countries growth rate. Remember we said that low-income countries, usually they have spare resources, so they grow faster compared to high-income countries, 2.8% over time. Middle-income countries grow, in this case that we're looking at here, 1.4% over time, and low-income countries, excluding China. So this is including China. That's why it's growing so fast. The population growth in the low-income countries is bigger than the population growth of the high-income countries. So the real GDP, or in this case GNP per capita growth rate, is negative in middle-income and low-income countries because the population is growing at a faster rate than the GDP growing. So look at this, 1.7% of population growth versus 1.4% of GDP growth. So that means that people are being born at a faster rate than goods and services. So that is actually a problem because then a negative growth rate over time is going to tell us, well, this country over time is not really producing enough for all its population. And still, we are not considering the inequalities inside those countries, which will be a different topic that we will address. Okay, I'm gonna skip this. This is just confirming or trying to talk about redundancy of what we have been looking at so far. This is how the USA produces compared to other countries, in this case, in terms of total GDP. So we see that USA produces a lot of money or a lot of goods and services compared to the rest of the world. We're going to just finish by looking at the GDP sectors. We call it the primary, the secondary, and the tertiary sector. Primary sector is one, or primary comes from one. The primary sector is agricultural production, okay? So everything that is produced using natural resources then is considered a primary sector. The secondary sector, as you may have thought, is actually the manufacture, or we call it industry as well, is goods that have been converted to other type of goods, like let's say t-shirts, shoes, cars, any manufacturer that has changed the nature of the natural resources, they are considered industrial or manufactured goods. They are the secondary sector. Just gonna write it here, secondary, I'm sorry guys, and this is primary. So primary sector, secondary sector, and the tertiary sector is services, okay? Tertiary sector has to do with intangible goods or services, as we call it. So let's say if I work in the construction sector, I will be providing a service, for example. If banking is also a service, a restaurant is a service, washing clothes is a service. So all of that is going to be a service sector-based economy, okay? So if we look at here, high-income countries have a higher proportion of their production is services. The reason why services is that many people are working now, women and men, and they hire people to clean the houses or to produce or to take care of their children. Those are services, or to produce food or to buy food in the restaurants, or travel industries, financial or banks. All of that are related with the services sector. Now, low-income countries have a higher agricultural or primary sector. They rely a lot on agriculture because they haven't been industrialized enough, which in this case we see it's still big, but is smaller. In this case, some countries will be producing more in the industrialized sector than the agricultural sector, but these two are still bigger compared to the tertiary sector, which is services, okay? These usually are unskilled workers, and this what happens here is that these are skilled workers. So if we go from the low developed countries or less developed countries or low income versus the high income, this is more skilled labor intensive versus unskilled labor intensive. So think about factories that need to hire people just to produce in the sweatshops or maquiladoras as they are called. They don't need people who are educated to produce this type of goods. Whereas here, well, this could be related with producing technology, high-tech production, or this could be related with education, for example. You will need people who are educated to produce education or health services, for example. So these are skilled labor forces, and the agricultural sector usually in these countries are minor. They will import the agricultural goods from the low-income countries. Economies in transition are in the middle, and that's what we're saying. Middle-income economies are still in transition from industrialization, going towards the high-income countries and moving to more service-based economy. So this is a question for you to think about. Economic growth is not enough. We need to think about what do we want the money for. Now, right now with the COVID pandemic, we're looking at, well, many people are not really working and they are not producing. People are stranded in their houses. Do we really need some of the goods that now we're not buying? We can still survive without those goods. So other people will say, well, how about the GDP growing because they are producing more bullets and arms and fire guns, etc., compared to another country that is producing more medicines or more food. So economic growth has to be evaluated in terms of what is the purpose of growing. The other question is for whom, how the growth is actually spilling over, who is getting that growth. And the last question is for how long time, or how long this growth may last. As you may have thought, this is about sustainability. And we may say, well, economic growth cannot be sustained over time if we're destroying the resources for growth. I'm not going to talk about this slide. I'm just going to leave it here for you to read, because this is just summarizing everything that we have talked about GDP and how the GDP is not taking everything into consideration. Okay. Okay, I'm going to leave it here. I'm going to look at the next slide, or the next presentation is going to be about business cycle, which is another important topic that we need to look at. So let's leave it here.